Want to talk about why I think Americans don't understand social welfare programs. Uh, there's going to be some twists and turns before we get to the punchline there, so bear with me. Also, you may have noticed my background's changing. I've been gone from the internet for a while. I live on a farm now. I'm actually just getting ready to do some composting, and I was making videos about composting. Uh, so I had my gear out here, and I'm like, oh, this idea just popped in my brain. I'd like to just get it out there. And it's not the sort of thing that's like, oh, I'm an expert and this is well researched and you should believe it. It's just a food for thought, something to ponder. Um, so I had a previous video where I was talking about the metaphysics of Buddhist sutras, and I talked a lot about ontology. It's sort of your inventory of things you believe exist in the universe, and that creates this sort of foundational categories that you divide your experience up into. Um, I think there's another category of things like that, the set of actions that you believe is possible in the world that fundamentally shapes how we are able to conceive of and understand the processes we see unfolding in the world around us. Um, as an example of that, because sometimes it's pretty silly. So over the summer, I had a couple of buddies stay up here with me, and we went hiking. And at one point, we were just doing some work around the farm. They were helping me out, and it was lunchtime. My buddy came into the kitchen and he had a big head of iceberg lettuce. He just starts chopping it up, right? He's just chopping it up. And I found myself thinking, what is he doing with that iceberg lettuce? Is he making like some kind of salad or something? And belatedly, I realized he was chopping it up so that he would have shredded iceberg lettuce to put on a sandwich because he enjoyed that. I've worked in sandwich shops. I've done that work many, many times. Uh, and it never occurred to me that that's something that you could do at home in your own kitchen just because you happen to enjoy the texture of shredded lettuce on a sandwich. Just wasn't in my inventory of possibility. Completely blew my mind that not that that was a possible thing in retrospect, obviously that's a possible thing, but that it had never occurred to me. That if you had asked me to list all of the things that one could do with lettuce, I probably could have sat there till the end of time and never come up with, well, you could buy it and take it to your home and chop it up so that you can put it on a sandwich that you make for yourself, even though, as stated, I've done that professionally many, many times. I know that people enjoy that. Um, and it's just bizarre the sorts of things that the human mind uh, will tie really intimately to certain contexts. That this is something that you get in a sandwich shop, but you don't do at home. Why the heck would I think that? That doesn't make any sense at all. But I have a squishy meat computer that's processing the world, and it sometimes just interprets the wrong sets of information as contextually important to when a process can unfold. Um, so that's an example of the sort of deficiencies that one could have that may not make any sense from like a big picture logical perspective in our understanding of what processes are possible in the world. So what does this have to do with social welfare programs? So it has to do with the difference between getting help if you are rich versus if you are poor, or even if you're sort of like rich is in the global sense, right? Like if you actually have disposable income above subsistence, you're actually rich in the sense of uh, the entire world order. Um, so nearly all Americans are rich in that sense. I mean, an alarming number are not. Don't get me wrong, um, but a substantial proportion of the U.S. population is rich in that sense and has been actually for quite some time. And if you are rich in that sense, when you need help, you pay for help. So if there's something wrong with your plumbing in your house, you pay a plumber. If there's something wrong structurally with your house, you pay a contractor. If a tree falls in your yard, you pay probably just some guy with a chainsaw, but maybe an arborist, right? The provision of help is all transactional. And that if you grow up in a household that is relatively stable, um, and in that condition for the whole of your childhood, um, that's what you internalize as a model. And like for me, even though I grew up in some dicey places And there were some times when we didn't have a lot. Still, like that was for the most part um, the experience that I had uh, as a young person growing up. That's what I saw. The adults in my world, when they needed help, they paid for help, and so all help was a thing that was acquired transactionally. But poor people just don't have that option. If you are poor, you don't have the disposable income to actually acquire the services that you need transactionally. You have to beg for help or you have to go without. Um, and so people who are brought up in that context, people who are in a family that does not have the disposable income to meet situational needs as they arise and has to rely on community support and get help from others that isn't conditioned on giving something in return, they end up with another option in their collection of possible actions that can be undertaken, which is to give help without expectation of return. And that is something that a lot of religions try to teach people, but in quite a lot of contexts in the world, that's just not going to be modeled in a way that is psychologically relevant to the development of the human person. Right? You can read that something is a possibility and intellectually understand it, but until you've seen it in action, you've actually seen it done, it just doesn't really register an impact on your inventory of possible future actions that you can undertake. Um, and what that leads to in countries that have been relatively stable for a very long time is this sort of division where you have huge swaths of the population that literally cannot conceptually understand the idea that somebody can have a need and that people in their community can step up and meet that need without expectation that that person has to give something back. That you can just have a non transactional meeting of needs. Um, and so, you know, wealthy and middle class people have more and are generally far less generous than poor people. That I think is a really well understood phenomenon. There's a quote from Steinbeck that's something to the effect of if you need help, you should look to the poor because you're not going to get it anywhere else. And I think that that's very socially real phenomenon. Um, so why then is there a disparity amongst developed countries between some developed industrialized countries that have major social safety nets that everybody's bought into? Everybody seems to conceptually have this idea that it's actually an okay thing to undertake to give people a benefit to meet a need without expecting those people to give something immediately in return. And places like the United States, where that just hasn't taken root. And so the idea that occurred to me is that the United States has been so geopolitically insulated for so long that to the north and south, we have smaller countries in terms of population and less militarily capable countries. Uh, And so we haven't had a geopolitical threat to our home population uh, in, you know, probably realistically since the Mexican American War. Um, you know, as, and we haven't really had a major incursion and trauma since, I don't know, the Canadians burned down the White House in the War of 1812. We had an unfortunate interscene conflict in the Civil War, but we haven't had an external force that really can challenge our social cohesion uh, in the way that many countries in Europe suffered during World War II. So the British, even though they share uh, a lot of tendencies with Americans that other folks in Europe would call unfortunate, I think that's this sort of uh, Protestant work ethic sort of stuff that Americans talk about. We get a bit of that from the Brits. But they still have the NHS and they still have a well developed social safety net. They're working on tearing it down at the moment, but they have those things, and they have those things because of the post war generation having the experience of the collective need to come together to meet everybody's needs without an expectation of return because everybody had to go through the trauma of the actual British home front being attacked. Like V2 rockets don't discriminate by social class, right? So all social classes had to deal with occasionally somebody in their immediate communities home being destroyed, and that family needs to be sheltered and fed, and their medical needs need to be addressed, and people in that community need to help them pick through the rubble and gather up as many of their undestroyed worldly possessions as possible so they can start rebuilding their life. People of all social classes, to my understanding, had to, if they were able to, send their children to the countryside, um, out of the London metropolitan area, just because of the continuous threat of bombing by the Germans and missile attacks by the Germans and whatnot. And that's, you know, in many senses, one of the least cases. If you look to um, countries all over continental Europe that were actually invaded by the Nazi Germans, or even invaded by the Italians uh, down in the Balkans and whatnot, or then were taken over by the Soviet Union. Um, Poland experiencing partition. Um, all of these states had circumstances that forced people to grow up in a context where they witness modeled to them by necessity people having their needs met by other members of the community without a transactional basis to it. That the transactional system had broken down under external pressure, and it became uh, a context where people who had the ability to meet a need met a need on the understanding that everyone was paying it forward. And certainly not everybody was paying it forward. You can't speak in broad generalizations. People suck everywhere in all times, and there were certainly people who were like profiteering off of the hardship of their neighbors, but the overwhelming majority of the population was forced under the pressures of external attack to pull together in a way that is not normal in a wealthy country, that is not experiencing an external pressure. And the United States did not have to do that. What's interesting is our institutions actually did that. So, through the Lend-Lease program, we sent an absolutely absurd amount of food and material to the Soviet Union to make sure that their uh, economy didn't collapse, so that Germany was forced to continue waging a two-front war. We understood geopolitically the necessity of that, and nominally all of the stuff was just being leased. It was going to be returned at the end of the war, right? Because we'll need all those truck chassis, and they're definitely going to send back all that spam. But most of that, everybody who was participating in that program knew that that debt was going to be forgiven or at least paid back at a very tiny rate. So we intellectually, institutionally understood the need to meet a need of an ally without uh, expectation of return, other than that they stay in the war, and therefore our course of military action is less difficult than it would be. But we didn't have that at an individual level as a society, where we had continual disruptions to the transactional patterns of needs getting met. We had sort of um, certainly the cartelization of most of American industry and the channeling of American industrial output into the war effort, and that pulls people together, but it doesn't model the uh, individual, seeing a parent figure look at their neighbor who has suffered a catastrophe and step in to provide for that person without expecting to immediately get anything back, that adds that to our inventory of things that we can do to the future that changes the way that we perceive the fundamental relationships in society, from transactional to sort of this uh, time delayed mutually beneficial arrangement that allows for the broad base of support for things like social institutions that meet people's needs when they are struggling, on the assumption that in the future they will be a contributing member of society who will make it possible for the needs of others to be met, and that is a net beneficial way to organize the society in a way that gets everybody's welfare met, and produces more long-term benefit than a strictly transactional, if you need something, you have to give me something in return uh, approach, which is the foundation of our systemic dysfunction in the United States, where we have to turn everything into capitalism, including the provision of very basic human needs, and our entire population suffers from that. You know, we spend more money on healthcare per capita than basically the entire rest of the industrialized world. We have worse health outcomes, and it's because of this fundamental notion that we couldn't just give people medical care when they need it. They have to give something in return, right? Right? Um, which is a systemic dysfunction that I think arises from the failure of wealthy societies to model non-transactional meeting of needs, which is why we should look for moral examples to the ways that people who experience poverty treat each other. That is that's a rant that was just popping in my head this morning as I'm getting all my composting material in order, but I actually do have to get to work, so maybe something will come of this and I'll post it, and maybe I won't.